So, music serves many purposes and fills many roles. It can be a mediator, a peacemaker, or a rallier. And in revolutionary America, music was way more than just a piccolo and snare drum playing Yankee Doodle. In reality, it was a developing and maturing new art form that would go to influence the view and perception of the people in revolutionary America tenfold. It was a developing and maturing art form that had real impact onto the sentiment of how Americans view the war effort. Revolutionary composers and the music that they represent shaped the opinions of the people around them into pro-patriot ideals and spread that onto the people of revolutionary and early independent America. Composers like some of the ones that we're going to discuss today not only spread those ideas and surrounded America in a new sound, but that was distinctive from that of the British, which kind of contributed to this separate identity that we see. We have this British tradition, and then we have a divergence in the American tradition that's going to help the people kind of view America as its own independent culture. It has its own independent art scene. We're not borrowing anything from the past, and this is going to help the people form a separate identity from the British. So to start our journey today, let's analyze where we're coming from. In order to truly understand the landscape of this new American culture, we have to understand where we're coming from again. So that would be with the British music scene. And up to this point, we have a British music scene that's very traditional, very established, and very, very formal. With the likes of people like Henry Purcell, we already have a set list of famous composers that were not only famous for their work, but famous as people as well, that the public knew and appreciated and respected. We also have industries such as publication and distribution of music that's bringing like an economic aspect to the British music scene. So we all this to see that we have a really established and well-versed system that is very traditional, very structured when we look at the art scene and the music scene in England before revolutionary America. Interesting thing about concerts is that they were almost more of a social event than a place just to listen to music in England. Especially in London, they kind of served as not necessarily like a status symbol, but again, just a place where social activity was almost at the forefront rather than music in many cases. And the fact that a lot of those concerts were kind of subjugated based on class does kind of contribute to the establishment of a formal and traditional English music scene that we don't quite see replicated when we are going to talk about America in a little bit. Where we really see this traditional and hardened nature of the British music scene is when we look across the 17th century, that there was kind of a competition for the expanse and the grandiose nature of music cultures across Europe, specifically in Italy. This is really highlighted in opera. So Italian opera was huge, very popular, very expansive, and England was kind of gaining this reputation of being lesser in that sense, for their opera not being as grandiose, as big, as heavy on production, and so that caused Britain to want to expand that. And not only did they start, building and creating bigger operas and better operas, they also started singing operas in Italian and kind of giving into some of that influence because the pressure was to expand the music scene, to make it more formal, to make it more big and attractive. And so that increases the formality of it, increases the traditionalness of it. And again, that kind of activity we do not see replicated in the initial American music scene as we'll see it in the 13 colonies. In comparison to the American music scene that we'll see develop a little bit later, the British music scene is also way more outward focused, like we see with incidents such as them singing Italian opera and them just being susceptible to European influence to better their musical tradition. America is a much more inward focused tradition, focused on, what does Americans want, what do American composers want, rather than what is going on in the world and how can we match that. It was a much more inward, direct focused music scene, as we'll see develop a little bit later. Okay, so now that we have a general understanding of kind of where we're coming from with the British music scene, let's take a trip across the ocean, head over to the colonies, and let's talk about some of the famous composers that kind of defined the American music scene and really shaped it into the foundations of what it's become today. All right, to start off our discussion of the specific composers that kind of shaped the American music scene, let's talk about Francis Hopkinson. Hopkinson is widely quoted to be America's first composer. He was born in 1737 in Philadelphia and kind of stayed there most of his life, or at least for most of his professional career. What's really cool about Hopkinson in particular, though, is over the course of his career, he was far more than just a musician, far more than just a composer. He was a true American statesman. We're talking about a man who signed the Declaration of Independence, who had input on the first American flag, and was a member of the Second Continental Congress. All of this was a widely unprecedented blending of a very famous musical figure, or who would gain lots of fame for his music, and someone who is deeply involved with politics, deeply involved with this emerging state, and has personal connection with a lot of the more famous figures that we know, like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, which we'll get into later. Okay, so we've established his importance, what he's done, but what are some of the specific pieces that have made an influence into the lives of people, when we're talking about music as a sort of unification and identifying a cultural piece that kind of created some separation from the British? So by far one of the clearest examples of a piece of music that was written by Hopkinson that definitely created pro-patriot sentiment, created a separate American musical identity, was the Temple of Minerva. This was America's first attempt at a grand opera, so we talked about kind of that in an English context, but in America, that still meant a full chorus, instrumentation, ballet, costumes, and way more. However, Hopkinson modestly refers to that as oratorial entertainment instead of a grand opera, and it was written in celebration of the French and American alliance, which was really interesting because, again, like we talked about with Britain, when they were gaining influence from the outside, they just say, okay, we're going to just sing Italian opera, right? Because we're having pressure from Europe, from the Italians, so we're just going to sing Italian opera. This is not an opera that's in French, even though it's celebrating French culture, the French alliance in the United States. Hopkinson did not focus it in French. This is still a very much a separate American piece, separate American identity, just with that dedication in mind. But where we really see a blending of popular music and pro-patriot and political sentiment is with the audience of this particular piece. So Temple of Minerva was first debuted on December 11th in 1781 to an audience that included George and Martha Washington and the French minister to the Continental Congress. So this is really awesome because now we have a clear path to legitimacy for Hopkinson's work. This is a very established thing. It is pro-patriot, pro-French in nature, and now we have both of those parties kind of giving their stamp of approval by being in the audience there. So this is not only giving legitimacy to the music, it's giving legitimacy to him as a person, and it's kind of solidifying this association we have between politics and music. And this association between art and state is super valuable when we're talking about the idea of Americans forming a separate identity in music and in culture from the British, and having that being a unifying force. Having this blending of these two worlds is very, very key in understanding that. Okay, so we talked about Temple of Minerva, but his other really popular piece that kind of demonstrates some aspect of these kind of two worlds blending is with his 7 pieces for harpsichord. So in this, it's really cool because this is a completely secular collection of songs, but it's still published, which is much harder to do back then because, again, publishing was largely given to liturgical music and church music, especially in the colonies, just because that was not as big of an industry by far in comparison to like some European counterparts. So that's really cool. And with this piece, we start to see one of the defining features of this new American music scene that is different than the British, and that is the simplicity of the music. This doesn't mean that the music is lesser or more basic or wrong. It just means that it is more accessible to the public, right? These songs are easier to play, they're easier to sing along to, and it means that kind of some of the walls and the tradition and the formality in comparison to like the British music scene is broken down when we have these simpler songs that are more directly for the people. They're not religious in nature, so they're not tied up to a specific ceremony or ritual. These are just songs that are being put out for the people, and they are very accessible, very simplistic, which is going to become a defining feature of many of the pieces that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But going back to that blending of art and state, in this context, we actually have this piece or this collection of pieces being dedicated to George Washington. So Hopkinson writes Washington a letter dedicating the pieces to him, and Washington actually writes back saying, that even though he can't physically play the music, he's not a musician, he can still go around telling them that it was the great Mr. Hopkinson that wrote this music. And that's really important to understand, because again, now we have a legitimacy and a validation of Hopkinson as a professional artist and as someone who's involved with the political state. So again, as his music gets more popular, everything surrounding it also gets more popular. So we have a raising of these pro-patriot ideals, because again, as Hopkinson gets more popular as a figure himself, his pro-patriot ideals will have more of a platform, because he himself is a big patriot. Again, we talked earlier, he signed the Declaration, all of the stuff like that. And so this is, again, where we see a big increase in his legitimacy, in his status, in his access, and his face time to the public as a result of his popular music. And in this case, the simplicity of that music, again, a defining feature of this new American music scene, is a huge player in that, because that's going to allow this music to become a lot more popular, a lot more accessible among the people. And that, combined with the dedication to Washington and him not only approving that, but contributing to that, is really huge in understanding this new distinctive identity. So on screen now is a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Francis Hopkinson on the 23rd of December, 1786. And this is really cool, because this is a really, really key and critical example of demonstrating how Hopkinson was, garnering a lot of fame and becoming very successful. Thomas Jefferson is in Paris at the time and writes to him about how, he is very important to Thomas Jefferson, and how he values his letter and hearing from him, and then goes to talk about a lot of official American business and kind of filling him in on stuff. And then in the second half of the letter, talks about his work and his experimentation on a new instrument. Hopkinson had helped out a little bit with the creation of this, but Thomas Jefferson is kind of filling him in on what this new instrument will be like, how it is similar to an organ foot pedal board mixed with a piano that goes on the floor, and is saying how this new instrument is going to be hugely successful and important. And he is talking about how he wants to make sure that Hopkinson is set up with one and has the ability to write on one. Jefferson even draws a little picture of what the keyboard instrument is to look like. He finishes the letter by saying that he had dislocated his right wrist, which means that he'd been unable to write for about a month or so. And he also goes on to say, I've been really using my hand sparingly. I haven't had the ability to write letters, but he is, spending what little energy he does have to write letters on Hopkinson, which again is a very clear statement by Thomas Jefferson, saying that Hopkinson is important, he's very valuable, and he needs to be in contact with him, because, in a time where he had been very sparingly with the letters he's writing, and in many cases not writing letters at all, he dedicates some of his ability to writing letters to Hopkinson.
'Tis Washington's health, fill the bumper all round, for he is our glory.
And so that's the story with Hopkinson. We see him kind of walking the line between music that's not political in nature, but with the dedication and the context surrounding that, does introduce pro-patriot ideals, and again brings this unification of the people under a common patriot sound. And we have him taking under this new proto-celebrity status, where he's getting the dedication from Washington and he's getting the attention from that. And again, that's going to help raise him as a platform, as a person, and his ideals along with that. All right, so our next revolutionary composer is Mr. James Lyon, and he was born in New Jersey in July of 1735. Lyon had a rich career in religious music, but he also definitely touched secular worlds as well. And he was finding a lot of ground in becoming a very well-known figure. By the end of his career, he was known himself just as much as he was his music, kind of continuing from where Hopkinson left off in that sense. And that's going to be a pattern we see with the rest of these composers that we talk about. His main claim to fame is definitely Urania, and Urania is a collection of spiritual music for the church. But despite that, it is still hugely popular among the people. It's maintains a simplistic style that is very singable, very accessible, kind of again where Hopkinson left off. So we can continue to kind of trace that simplistic, accessible nature as a defining characteristic of American music. The popularity is said to have prompted 5 later versions of Urania. However, none of these have been recovered today, so these are all theorized. But again, that is kind of what's speculated and kind of can help us gauge the popularity of this piece a little bit. So one interesting aspect about Urania when we're talking about the accessibility of this music is the fact that it included singing instructions. And so that's going to mean that the people are much more inclined to gravitate towards this music because, again, it's easier for them to grab onto. Not only is it simple, the path to sing it and to play it is spelled out for them in the music, which is very intentional and, again, shows us this defining feature of American music. And that right there kind of helps us point to the fact that they're unifying under a common sound, because the more popular this music gets, the more homes that this music reaches, the more churches that this music reaches, they're going to unify under a common sound. You know, it is a very quick and effective way to kind of build an overarching tradition in America, especially in a time where unification was a struggle in a lot of cases for the colonies, and where music can serve as a really good way to kind of capture some of that. The other really interesting tidbit from James Lyon is not inherently a piece of music, but he moved up to Nova Scotia with his family for a brief period, and while he was there, he actually sent letters to Washington saying, hey, listen, there is no competition here. We are totally fine. If you want to send me troops, I will lead an entire campaign to capture Nova Scotia for the Continental Army. He planned it out. He sent him all the details he needed about, why he thinks that this is possible, where they need to attack, what supplies they need, like cannons and guns and stuff. And it's really interesting because this guy is a composer, right? He's not a general. He doesn't have war experience, and so it's very interesting to again show how these composers served many more purposes than just putting out nice music in revolutionary America. They were very influential people that made real impact. And while this campaign never went through, Washington didn't have the troops to spare, we can still see the back and forth between them. I mean, there is a letter that you're seeing on screen now that talks about this whole thing and how we have to attack this city here with these cannons here, and it's really interesting because again it shows the legitimacy of these people as more than just classical composers, but as actual celebrities, actual important statespeople, and as people who are accessible to people like George Washington, who are very valuable with their time. And so for Washington to receive this letter and write back shows that Lyon, Hopkinson are people of importance to him. And so that also, again, says a lot about how Washington views this music and these people as important to a unifying force of revolutionary America as well. After Lyon left Nova Scotia, he settled into Maine for the rest of his life, lived a comfortable life, serving in churches there, and kind of snowball effect, a lot more popularity locally, but again also for his previous catalog of music, and kind of just again to ride on him as a figure of importance himself. And so again, that really shows how we're starting to now just see these famous pieces are rising, but also these famous composers that can be seen as great parallels to kind of modern artists that we have today, where they take on just as much importance as the music that they produce. Okay, so our final important composer is William Billings, and while he does have a versatile catalog, he mainly focused on choral music throughout his career. By far the most popular and best example of this is The Rose of Sharon. This, again, is a very accessible, easy, versatile piece of music, similar to a lot of the vocal stuff Lion was writing for the church. But kind of going even further than Lion, one main difference with Billings is that he's not classically trained. He is self-trained. He does not have much experience traditionally in composing and in performance, which is a huge departure from the British music scene, not only just the American music scene that we've established thus far. And so again, this is really leaning into that kind of more gritty, less less walls, less formal, more accessible nature that I've been hammering in, is because we have composers that aren't even like part of the classical academia approach to music. They're just going out there writing music for the people as they themselves received it when they were younger. But in no way does the more simplistic nature of the music or the fact that he wasn't technically trained impact the popularity whatsoever. If anything, it increased it, because Billings was a hugely popular composer with much of his work, much of his catalog, and that really extends not only to the view of the public, but also the view of the Continental Army as well. With the Army, we see a really, really clear as day connection between Billings' music and pro-patriot ideals, and him helping to form this unique identity and separate sound from the British, and that is seen with his Chester song. In the lyrics, it discusses the superiority of the Americans, the inferiority of the British, and not only that, it has tons of religious imagery to back this up. So we're invoking God in these lyrics. We're talking about how there is a spiritual justification for war on behalf of the Americans, and this is not only now tying music with politics, it's tying religion with politics, it's tying faith with politics. And so all of these things is just like kind of all these aspects of life that can kind of form an identity in someone, and kind of tying them around patriotism and separating them from the British to really drive home this point of unification and separation from British through an art form. And now through pieces like Chester Song, we have an association of spiritual music and secular music. So all of these lines are getting, kind of blurred in one way or another to just say, this is American music. It's all encompassing. There are less boundaries, less gaps, less walls that kind of demarcate these specific areas of music into one location or another. No, it's just American music. Here it is, and this is how it's being impactful. All of these things come together to just, it's just American music. There is not a whole lot of category to kind of demarcate these specific pieces in different areas. We have the composers that made them and the music that they follow, and they're all distinctively American together. So those are our three main revolutionary composers that really demonstrate greatly the path between associating politics with their music, associating pro-patriot ideals with their music, and just, again, helping form a unique American sound that is a separate identity from the British. But we do have some more pieces to talk about. However, these aren't credited to a specific influential American composer. So the first of these is the Disappointment Opera, and while this music isn't credited to any composer or individual in particular, whoever did write it took the alias of Andrew Barton. However, we don't know anything else beyond that for who actually composed this piece. Many credit this as being America's first traditional opera. It is set in Philadelphia, and it is a comedy. The fact that America's first true opera is a comedy, I think is again very telling of the accessibility of this music, but also now another defining feature of the American music scene. It's less serious. We've talked about, how it's less formal, but along with that, we have a lack of seriousness and more lightheartedness that's introduced, with the simpler music. But now we have a more direct way to focus in on that by just saying, no, this is just a straight up comedy. This is the defining American opera at the time, and it is a comedy, and it is not only that, but it's set in Philadelphia, a place very important to the Revolution. So we already are setting up the grounds to have a really great connection between patriot politics and this music, but it goes further than that. So, amid the political satire and heavy comedy, we have a story revolving a group of young people on a search for a long lost treasure across America. And they face opposition, they face antics in the process. But in the story, there's an overarching general theme of young prevailing and old failing, old dying, and new traditions and new grounds being born. And I mean, think about that as a parallel between the young burgeoning country of America in comparison to the old established British forces. And so when we talk about, the theme of this opera with its political satire, and we place that in the context of the reality of America at the time, we see a very, very, very clear connection between the two, that, we are saying, America has a better justification for this. We are young, but we are strong, and old England stuck in his ways, but we will prevail eventually. So, the more you read about this opera, the stronger that comparison gets. And while many of these references are indirect, they are very plain in nature, and is one of the best and clear examples of a piece of music building the sentiment of a separate American identity that is not only separate, but also superior to that of the older British tradition. Okay, to end our discussion, let's talk about the one that, if you're going to know one piece of music from the American Revolution, it's going to be this one. That, of course, is Yankee Doodle. So there's no doubt you've heard this tune before. It is very iconic, very classic, and is the piece of music that is associated with the American Revolution. But the story is really interesting. So the actual melody is said to associate in Scotland, but it is rather unclear on specifically where it came from and when it was there. But the reality is that it did come over with the British Army, and it was actually first used by the British as a derogatory term. So they, the term Yankee was very negative in nature. It was derogatory, slanderous against the Americans, and Yankee Doodle as a song was used by the British Army, again, to make fun of, to make light of, and be derogatory towards the American Army. But again, talking about the less serious nature of the American music scene and the unification of it, we see Yankee Doodle sometime after the Battle of Bunker Breed's Hill switch sides. So the Americans kind of take the term Yankee and make the best of it, and make it as kind of an endearing term instead of a derogatory one, and actually take Yankee Doodle and now make it kind of a foundational sound of the American Army. So to me, the main takeaway of this is to show that the American music scene is far less serious and far less formal than that of their British counterpart, because they were willing to take this melody that the British were using and be inventive, be creative, and flip the tables, and now not only use the term Yankee, but take the melody and make the best of it, and now not only being okay with it, but making it like a war cry that the entire Continental Army can kind of unify under, and have pro-patriot ideals and love for their country under. And that extends to the people too. And so we see with the people and with the Army now that they all have their individual music that they can unify under and feel like they're sharing a common identity with everyone in the colonies under, which is what America so desperately needed during the time of the Revolutionary War, and just after the American Revolution. So after discussing all of these people and talking about all this music, it's clear that the developing American music scene was different from the British. In no way, shape, or form was it a reinstation of British culture or British tradition or British formality. It is a complete departure from everything in the tone, in the quality, in the seriousness, in the formality, in every aspect was different and uniquely American. It was a dynamic and distinctive expression of American identity that really went miles to, again, forming a perception of the people as this unifying sound, as the music was associated with these pro-patriot ideas, with the idea of American as an independent state, and as America as a superior force to that of England. Not only do we have self-taught musicians, we have accessible and easily singable music with instructions built right in. We have operas that are comedies that are huge and massive in scale and are directly linking, again, the superiority of Americans and the inferiority of the British. And we have, war songs that were directly taken from the enemy and flipped on their heads and become a positive term. So all of these things are incredibly creative, incredibly inventive, and really point to a different kind of beat that the Americans were taking with their early music through people like Francis Hopkinson, James Lyon, and William Billings. All of these people massively contributed to this new American identity as it was coming during the time of Revolutionary America and just after. And all of this sets up a deeply foundational and important art form that goes miles to shaping what it means to be an American then and what it means to being an American today. Thank you.